There are lots of people in Britain who are cheering President Trump on and who want him to sue the BBC because they're a huge problem. They've lied, they've cheated, they've fiddled with footage, both in the case of President Trump, but also covering up what's happening in Britain, whether it's mass migration, whether it's our economic problems. They are always biased towards the left, and the British taxpayer has had to pay for all of this fake news. So there is a lot of excitement amongst conservatives in Britain at the moment that President Trump is actually taking the BBC on.
We're going to walk down to the Capitol, and I'll be there with you, and we fight. We fight like hell. We're going to walk down to the Capitol, and we're going to cheer on our brave senators and congressmen and women.
Do you think an apology from the BBC is enough?
No, I don't, because they keep doing it again and again. They have painted a completely false picture of President Trump in Britain over a number of years. They've done the same thing about conservatives in our country. And I believe the organization needs to be defunded. And as well as suing the BBC, I think it would be fantastic if President Trump were to encourage stopping the British taxpayer funding. What is fake news that is damaging Britain's reputation? I mean, the BBC used to be the paragon of journalism across the world. It was respected. It's now become a laughing stock, and it needs to be put out of its misery.
I think I have an obligation to do it. Look, I'm not looking to get into lawsuits, but I think I have an obligation to do it. This was so egregious. If you don't do it, you don't stop it from happening again with other people. I think you probably have an obligation. I'd like to find out why they did it. It's so bad.
Yeah.
Who thinks like this? And I wonder if they've done it. We'll find this out. The nice part about litigation is we'll find out how many times have they done it to other people.
BBC v Trump, it certainly isn't going away. Donald Trump's former Chief of Staff, Mick Mulvaney, went on BBC Newsnight back in 2022 and warned that that wasn't the speech, that it had been edited incorrectly and gave the wrong idea what Trump actually said on that day. Here was that warning that the BBC didn't take heed of.
Your video actually spliced together the presentation. He said, we're going to go down and we're going to cheer on our senators and our House members. And then it actually goes on to say, in some of them we might not be able to. And that line about it, we fight and fight like hell, is actually later in the speech. And yet your video makes it look like those two things came together. That's the type of messaging here that so many people in my country find frustrating, is that it's hard to actually get the facts.
And joining me now is former White House Chief of Staff Mick Mulvaney. Good to see you, Mick. So when you said that on BBC, what was the reaction of the hosts?
None whatsoever. And in fact, I had forgotten about it until Trump brought it up this particular week. But yeah, we had a long discussion about that. Interview actually goes on. And we talk about the importance of actually understanding the facts of what happened that day and what didn't happen that day. And if the media, in that particular circumstance, the BBC, is going to splice things together that are just false, it makes it really, really hard to have an intelligent conversation about that. Look, I'm not looking to relitigate January 6th. I've talked about that a lot. This is about whether or not the BBC intentionally changed something to make Donald Trump look bad. Now, they could be forgiven for doing it on the first hand, right? Say, oh, my goodness, it was a mistake. But then I brought it to their attention, and they didn't change it for 3 years. I think that's one of the things that's at the crux of the dispute right now with the White House.
Yeah, so we're just reminding the BBC that they can't say they didn't know because you told them live on air, and there's proof of that we've just shown. So after you said that on air, the host didn't react, there was no follow-up from management, and they just shrugged it off? Is that pretty much what happened?
Yeah, in fact, I was in London just a couple of days ago when this story broke. You can imagine that was an interesting place to be. And there's some stories coming out about how some people inside the BBC said, my goodness, how did we do this? Does anybody, want to talk about this? And they didn't. They just moved on. In fact, when this story did break about 10 days ago, it took the BBC almost a week to respond to it now. So no, I think the BBC has just been completely incapable of admitting that they did something really, really wrong. And a lot of folks have lost their jobs for it. Maybe BBC will lose some money for it as well.
Yeah, I think so as well. And I think, Mick, it's important to take stock in this conversation, just the influence the BBC has. Of course, not a lot of Americans watch the BBC, but that aside, the BBC around the world has a lot of influence. So, these people aren't going to vote for Donald Trump or vote against him because they don't live in America. But it does have an influence on, the framing of him, the framing of his presidency and what he actually stands for. The BBC, the most trusted news source, well, it used to be in the UK. And there's something like, I think, 40% of Britons that watch it. There is no channel in America that has that kind of share. I think the most is about 25 to 30%. BBC has world service as well, so it's been right across the Middle East, right around the world too. So that's why it's so important. A lot of people might be asking, why are we talking about the BBC so much? We're talking about its influence out of the UK and within the UK as well.
That's right. Nobody who watched this interview, although the BBC does have an outlet in America called BBC America. I cannot remember if that show broadcast here or not. But it's not the rank and file people watch this, Laura. To your point, it's world leaders watch the BBC. All around the world, people form their opinion in large part on Donald Trump based on what they see on television in their home countries. I'll never forget when I gave a speech in Norway right after the election. I asked about 100 people if they had thought that Donald Trump had a chance to win, and only 2 or 3 of them raised their hand. That's how biased some of the information that people see overseas is. And as it turns out this week, apparently the BBC was one of the leading voices with that bias. So I hope it gets worked out. It looks like some folks, again, have lost their jobs at the BBC. They've yet to apologize to the president, which I thought was a little strange. But again, maybe just shedding light on it is enough. The people know even the BBC at times can't be trusted.